Hey, how y'all doing? This is Mongo. Thank you for choosing the magnificent MongoSlade for all your wrestling information and content. Like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get into the video. The week of July 13th marks the 5th anniversary of the WWE's debut of the Four Horsewomen: Sasha Banks, Becky Lynch, Charlotte, and Bayley. And for fans, there have been much debate on who deserves credit for the success of the new age of women's wrestling in WWE. Some think it should be Stephanie McMahon, a female executive who seemingly pushed for greater representation of women in the company. Some argue the credit should go to the anti-divas like AJ Lee and Paige, who wanted to expand the roles of women in WWE, meaning more time, better creative, and more focus. In this video, I will discuss why I think the credit belongs to some very different entities. One, Vince McMahon and Triple H, the men who had the vision to expand the roles of women in wrestling and were willing to invest in the product. Two, to Japan, a place where the women found a system which works to elevate the female performer. And three, and finally, to the audience, to responding to the call to increase the women's role in wrestling. In order to make this argument, we have to go back to the 1980s. So Vince McMahon buys the rights to the NWA Women's Championship from the fabulous Moolah, who was the queen pin of women's wrestling for more than 30 years. Moolah had been responsible for training and getting women booked for years. As an aside, we will not be litigating the allegations surrounding Moolah. We will stick straight to the facts. Women's wrestling for a long time had been a sideshow, similar to midgets and tag matches. Vince wanted to turn them into a regular attraction, presenting them alongside the men, but not exactly with the same amount of focus. In the 1980s, the WWF was defined by the Rock and Wrestling Connection, the success of which led into WrestleMania. The Rock and Wrestling Connection was spearheaded by WWF's relationship with MTV, and the lead angle of this program was a women's angle featuring singer Cyndi Lauper. The popularity of Lauper was attached to Wendy Richter, the WWF Women's Champion at the time, and her feud with the Fabulous Moolah and the Fabulous Moolah's protege, Leilani Kai. Their feud was featured on the very first WrestleMania. Leilani Kai, like Richter, was a focus in the WWF, as she also became one half of the short-lived WWE Women's Tag Team Championships with the Glamour Girls with Judy Martin. The women's division in WWE died due to a lack of depth and demand. Richter left or was screwed, whichever one you due to a financial dispute with Vince McMahon. One thing that cannot go undiscussed is the territorial system of the time. Wrestlers often worked a tour of a territory and then left before the act grew stale. This kept them fresh and gave the audience the illusion of depth. The women's wrestlers were no different. The women were often brought in for a single match or short series within a territory before being sent away. Vince McMahon booked women's wrestling and kept a stable of women's wrestlers for 7 years between 1983 and 1990, which was progressive for the time. The last WWF champion was Rockin' Robin, who was champion for 2 years before she left and the title was disbanded or abandoned shortly thereafter. The division lay dormant for nearly 4 years until Vince McMahon tried again to resurrect it by pushing Medusa, who was working under the name of Alundra Blaze. This short resurgence in providing women's wrestling, which hit a similar snag to the previous one. The division continued to suffer from a lack of depth, and the WWE did not have the funds to maintain it, as the WWF was in dire financial straits in the mid-90s. Blaze is thought to be one of the last real women's champions in the WWF, because for the next 20 years, the company featured mostly half-trained models. Occasionally, a legitimate women's wrestler such as Ivory or Jacqueline would claim the title, but it was mostly a time where the quote-unquote wrestling part was the least necessary part of the business. The WWF had become edgier. Sex and violence had permeated the WWF product. And this is why Vince McMahon's influence on the division is largely dismissed or downplayed. The years of Playboy Playmates and bra and panties matches have long eclipsed focus on women's wrestling, even at times where there was no demand for the product. Let's discuss what is termed the Divas era for a moment. The popular perception of WWF women's wrestling post-1995 is that there were bimbos with fake boobs and models looking to use wrestling to make themselves famous. Sure, there were many of those, and the stereotype exists for a reason. But why are we neglecting the good wrestlers of the era? In the midst of the Playmates and the Divas were often good women's wrestlers on the WWF roster. Molly Holly, Gail Kim, Ivory, Jacqueline, Jazz, Victoria, Michelle McCool, Mickie James, Caitlin, Beth Phoenix, Lena, Melita, all wrestled between 2001 and 2010. Sure, the Kelly and her ilk existed, but is the concept of hiring someone and then retraining them really a foreign concept? Because someone doesn't have a wrestling background, they can't be a wrestler? Is there an unspoken rule against being a model and turning into a wrestler? This Thespian concept of wrestling is nonsense. The average person will switch jobs multiple times in their lives. Is it hard to accept that someone who switches to wrestling from another field? No. Now, I call it Thespian because it's based off of Lou Thesz, who was the former NWA World Heavyweight Champion and didn't believe that you could be a world champion in wrestling unless you had a collegiate background. So he refused to do jobs for people who had collegiate background. But then Lou Thesz also refused to do jobs for people who did have a collegiate background, like Vern Gagne. So let's get back to my script. The sexism of feminism tells us that anything a beautiful woman achieves was achieved due strictly to her beauty. The concept of ambition, work ethic, and desire have no place. If a woman with little to no athletic background took it upon herself to train and invest effort into trying something, she should be rewarded. Men often come from non-wrestling backgrounds. Some have no athletic background to speak of. The list of bouncers and gym rats turned wrestlers, guys like Batista, the Road Warriors, Barry Darsow, is often longer than those who were once models. Were they less wrestlers than others? That's a debate you should have in the comment section, perhaps. In the WWE, if the WWE, responding to the audience demand, features attractive women in a wrestling role and continue to do so, so be it. WWE should respond to the audience, right? If people are buying the merchandise of the women or paying to see them, isn't that the goal? WWE often focuses on men who have little to no athletic background. Those men, if properly motivated and trained to unlock their inner talent or potential, can succeed, then there is no reason why the women shouldn't get the same opportunity. Besides, Trish Stratus, Candice Michelle, Ashley Massaro, Maurice, Eva Torres should be commended for how good they were despite their lack of wrestling and athletic ability. Their dedication to training and working hard despite the lack of appreciation or approval by wrestling snobs should be commended. Wrestling is not easy, and for a woman, it had to be even harder because few wrestling schools even accepted women. Due to the lack of facilities, there was often a dearth of women on any wrestling roster. As I mentioned earlier, even in the modern world, there is still not that many women's wrestlers, and few of them are actually good. To those that are good, I give credit to Japan. Japan is notoriously held as the crown jewel of women's wrestling. In Japan, women's wrestling is held in fairly high regard. The training regimen of Japanese wrestling created a system capable of pumping out talented performers who in turn spread out all over the world. Joshi Puroresu featured fast-paced matches, which were often physical and high-flying, while also being technically sound. The focus on the basics of pro wrestling would give them an edge over their American competitors. The popularity of Joshi wrestling led to the creation of Joshi promotions, which were often more popular and put out a higher quality product than the Americans. Japan had become the holy land of women's wrestling, and women from the United States and Europe often made a pilgrimage there to train and to work. However, the women's wrestling scene in Japan often hit the same skid as the American divisions. Lack of interest. Women's wrestling is a niche product, even in Japan. In 2008 and 2019, somewhere abouts, Viceland released a documentary on the Japanese promotion World Wonder Ring Stardom, a Japanese women's wrestling promotion. In this documentary, the progressives at Vice decided to problematize women's wrestling in Japan. The documentary saw fit to make an issue of the 98% male audience, who were presented as creeps and incels, the promoter, who was presented as a heartless street pimp on par with Iceberg Slim, and of course the women themselves were viewed as victims, selling themselves and destroying their bodies for pennies. While some of these issues were legitimate, such as Stardom's use of underage girls, which you could actually chalk up to cultural differences, I walked away from the documentary with a single question. Am I supposed to like women's wrestling or not? A paradox was created. If I'm a fan of women's wrestling, but I don't like women's wrestling, well, if I'm a fan of wrestling and I don't like women's wrestling, I'm a misogynist. If I do like it, then I'm a pervert who only watches it for the titillation of my male gaze. I did not walk away with an excitement to help boost women's wrestling, which I'm guessing was the goal of the documentary. I walked away with a sense of simply there was no way to win. This was just my personal experience, however, and many Westerners enjoyed Stardom and speak highly of the product. In 2019, Stardom ended up being purchased by Bushiroad, which is the same company that owns New Japan Pro Wrestling. So even in Japan, women's wrestling is still considered niche. The niche nature of women's wrestling often leads to financial inequality between the men and the women. The purchase of Bushiroad will hopefully mean greater investment in the joshi puroresu product, at least at Stardom. Japan had 2/3 of the Magic Triangle figured out: training and roster depth. What they did not have, however, was demand. Women's wrestling was simply not marketable to the masses. Enter NXT. NXT was the training program put all the right pieces in place. Triple H, the architect of NXT, deserves plenty of credit. Creating a facility for the specific purpose of finding and polishing wrestling talent was not a far-fetched venture. WWE had plenty of training programs before, and those systems had women's performers, but never had the level of investment and time been put forward. The NXT system produced the 4 Horsewomen. It was the effort of the NXT system which created the demand, showing that women's wrestling can become marketable to the masses. The women of the WWE main roster during this time, somewhere between 2012 and 2014, were getting 6 minutes a night, twice a week. The NXT women were given more time to develop stories in the ring and outside of it. The women of NXT were given the opportunity to become stars and were getting rave reviews for their work. Of course, their main roster women were miffed. They believed if they were given the same amount of time, they could also become stars. From this belief was born the infamous hashtag Give Divas a Chance. It was this hashtag which was either created or boosted by the Bella Twins, depending on who you believe, which created the online demand to give the women more time to become stars on the main roster of WWE. Now, the Bella Twins were much aligned by the wrestling audience. Entering the wrestling business via WWE's Diva Search, they were the prototypical model turned wrestler. All their hard work operating not just as in-ring performers, but also ambassadors of the business really meant nothing. Their kind was simply not appreciated. A new era was needed. No more models, no more playmates, no more butterfly belts. The era of the diva was soon killed off and replaced with the Evolution, a fitting brand. For the next 5 years, the women of WWE carried the torch of women's wrestling, breaking down barriers and changing the business. Of course, this only happened due to the struggles of those who came before them and those who were trying all along. Women's wrestling has a history going back to the 1930s, but for some reason, a brief period in time between 1997 and 2012 had come to dominate what most people believe women's wrestling to have been. This wasn't even true in the WWE. The Divas era actually produced some good women's matches, and it's okay for you to have been too young to appreciate them or for you to not care. But to pretend it was all bra and panties matches, which were just distaff versions of the male tuxedo match, by the way, is false. This man had a vision of featuring women's wrestling regularly and not just as quote-unquote special attractions. Now the women have main evented WrestleMania 35 after years of false starts of making a go of the division. The Japanese created a system making women wrestling world-class performers with their own promotions and gave them the opportunity to become stars around the world. The Joshis are now the backbone of many American and European pro wrestling companies such as AEW and Ring of Honor, in addition to WWE. And Triple H's NXT lit the spark which created the demand for women's wrestling. The women's division of NXT is now a driving force of the brand and continuing to grow rapidly. The fans responded and financially supported the endeavor, making the investment of time and effort worthwhile and helped it grow. The political climate also helped tremendously in turning things around as people were more accepting to seeing women given time to become stars. An afterword. The concept of women's wrestling being nothing more than sexual exploitation for the male gaze helped get women's wrestling banned by several state athletic commissions during the 1940s and 1950s. Another part of the decision to ban women's wrestling was to protect women from physical danger. The patriarchal system, which actually existed at that time, refused to treat women as adults with agency over their own lives. This meant women's wrestling in the United States took a massive setback in popularity. When those rules began to be relaxed and women's wrestling was allowed to return, audiences needed to be retrained in ways to appreciate them. You can take that for what it's worth. Now for a little opinion. I have been a strong believer that the WWE should create their own women's brand. I'm talking a weekly program for women only. Why? Because despite WWE producing 7 hours of program weekly, there still isn't enough time to develop all the female performers that they have. The women are battling for real estate on Raw, SmackDown, and NXT, and many of them are losing. Sometimes weeks would go by with certain women's performers not being featured in any way. Now, some people would say that a women's brand would flop, that nobody would pay to see it, nobody would watch it on TV. I say it's worth a chance. Daily, pretty much, I see people saying that the women are the best part of the WWE programming, how they outperform the men and they are the real stars of the show. This is subjective, so I really can't debate it. But I believe that the WWE's women's division is strong enough to carry their own brand. So, let me know what you guys think. Like, share, and subscribe. And I'll talk to you guys later. Thank you for listening.